The prairie stretched wide and endless, rolling under the vast sky like a restless ocean of grass and dust, the wind carrying whispers of the old frontier and the ghosts of men who had died nameless upon it, and in that expanse, where solitude was both a curse and a companion, stood a weather-worn cabin with its boards faded gray and its roof patched with tin that rattled on storm nights, and within that lonely dwelling lived Mary Henshaw, a widow hardened by years of loss and the cruel indifference of the land, her hands roughened from chopping wood and tilling a meager garden, her eyes dulled by grief yet still carrying a trace of warmth that life had not managed to snuff out entirely, for Mary was a woman who had once known love and laughter, once known the steady embrace of her husband John before fever swept through like wildfire and laid him beneath a mound of earth out back where the cottonwoods swayed and whispered above his grave, leaving her with nothing but the cabin, a small patch of soil, and the silence that crept into her bones each long night, and though the folks in town whispered that she was a hermit, too stubborn to leave her land and too proud to seek company, Mary endured, finding solace in her chores, in prayer, in the sound of her rocking chair creaking against the porch as the sun sank low and the coyotes howled in the distance. Yet even her resilience wavered on evenings when the loneliness pressed so hard upon her chest she feared she might suffocate beneath it, and it was on such an evening, as dusk painted the horizon in bruised purples and the prairie wind carried a chill that spoke of early autumn, that Mary heard a sound unlike the usual chorus of wind, insects, and distant cries of beasts, a dragging, stumbling shuffle along the dirt track that wound past her fence, and at first she thought it a trick of the wind or perhaps some half-wild cow wandering off the trail, but when she stepped to the door, her fingers brushing the stock of the shotgun leaning against the wall, her eyes fell upon a figure swaying and staggering toward her gate, and her breath caught as she saw not a beast nor outlaw but a boy, tall yet gaunt, his shoulders bent with exhaustion, his clothes torn and filthy, his face pale beneath the dust, and before she could call out, the boy collapsed against her fence post with a soft groan that carried more defeat than pain, his body folding as if it had finally surrendered its fight against hunger, thirst, and the merciless road, and Mary, though her heart hammered with caution, though every instinct told her the prairie was no place to trust strangers, could not turn from the sight of that youth so near death, for compassion ran deeper in her than fear, and so she set the shotgun aside, gathered her skirts, and hurried to his side, kneeling in the dirt to lift his head, finding his lips cracked and his skin hot with fever yet trembling with cold, and she whispered, "Lord have mercy. You'll die out here," before sliding her arms beneath him with a strength born of necessity, dragging him inch by inch toward her door, the weight of him heavier than she expected for someone so wasted by starvation, and with great effort she brought him to her bed, laying him upon the quilt she herself had stitched in better days, then fetched water from the bucket by the hearth and tilted it to his lips, watching as he swallowed greedily though his hands shook too much to hold the cup, and next she brought him what food she had at hand, a hunk of cornbread, some dried beans soft from soaking, and he devoured it like a starving wolf, every bite trembling between his teeth as if his body scarcely believed it was being fed, and when at last he slumped back against the pillow, his chest heaving but his eyes slightly clearer, he managed one word, his voice cracked and hoarse but steady enough to reach her ears. "Eli," he said, and Mary understood it to be his name, nothing more, nothing less, a boy reduced to a single syllable by hardship, and she nodded softly, answering, "Rest, Eli, you're safe now," though she knew safety on the frontier was a fragile promise at best, still she meant it with the whole of her weary heart, and so began the days of tending, for Eli's body fought fever through the nights, sweat soaking the quilt as Mary kept vigil, sponging his brow with cool water, whispering prayers to a God she had long since ceased to understand but still called upon in moments of desperation. And as dawns broke one after another over the rolling plains, Eli's strength slowly returned, his cheeks gaining a hint of color, his limbs less brittle, and though he spoke little at first beyond the necessities of hunger and thirst, Mary came to learn his story piece by piece, words falling from him like stones from a burdened sack. He had been riding with a cattle drive, he said, hired on as a drover despite his youth, but fever had slowed him, made him weak, and when he could no longer keep pace, the trail boss had left him behind, no room for mercy on a drive where profit mattered more than boys, and so he wandered, stumbling from one dry creek bed to another until his strength failed him at her gate, and Mary, hearing this, felt a sharp ache in her chest, for it seemed the world was always eager to cast aside the frail, the sick, the unwanted, and she saw in his plight a mirror of her own abandonment by fate, by death, by the indifference of those who whispered about her from afar yet offered no hand of comfort, and so she fed him, clothed him in an old shirt that had once belonged to John, and gave him tasks as his strength allowed, first small chores like fetching water or sweeping the porch, then heavier work like chopping wood or mending the fence, and Eli, eager to prove his worth, performed each duty with a quiet diligence, never complaining, his eyes often flicking toward her as though seeking some measure of approval, and though Mary told herself he was only a boy, a stray in need of shelter, she could not ignore the way the cabin's silence grew softer with his presence, the way his voice filled the air with trail songs hummed under his breath, the way his laughter, rare but genuine, stirred something in her that had lain buried beneath grief for years, and one night, as rain pattered upon the tin roof and the fire burned low, Eli spoke from his pallet near the hearth, his voice tentative yet certain, saying, "You saved me, Miss Mary. I was nothing but a ghost out there, and you gave me life again," and though she sat with her sewing in hand, she felt her fingers falter, her throat tighten, for his words pierced through the armor of solitude she had built around herself, awakening a warmth she thought forever lost, and she wanted to tell him he was mistaken, that she had only done what anyone with a scrap of decency might do, yet the truth lay heavy in her heart, that she had saved him because she too longed to be saved from the endless quiet, from the weight of days without purpose beyond survival, and so she merely answered, "You'll mend, Eli. Strong boys like you always do," but her eyes betrayed the tremor of emotion she could not voice, and he, watching her, seemed to see more than her words revealed, and from that night their bond deepened, unspoken yet palpable, a tether between two souls the world had cast aside, one a widow burdened with years and silence, the other a youth robbed of childhood by hunger and abandonment, and as weeks melted into months, Eli grew into his strength, no longer the wasted boy who had stumbled to her gate but a tall, steady young man with calloused hands and eyes that no longer carried only despair but also fire, and Mary, though she tried to remain only his benefactor, only the widow who had offered him shelter, could not deny that the rhythm of her life had changed, her loneliness pierced by his presence, her cabin no longer echoing with emptiness but alive with the sound of wood being split, buckets being carried, and sometimes the low murmur of his voice when he thought she was not listening, saying her name softly, reverently, as if testing the weight of it upon his tongue, and one morning, as they stood side by the corral, watching the sun lift golden over the endless grass, Eli spoke with a steadiness that belied his youth, saying, "You're all I got in this world, Mary, and I don't aim to leave. If you'll have me, I'll stay. I'll call you wife," and the earth seemed to tilt beneath her, her breath catching as she turned to face him, her mind a storm of protest, of the years that divided them, of the tongues that would wag in town, of the impropriety of such a bond, yet all those thoughts faltered against the simple truth shining in his eyes that saw her not as a lonely widow weathered by time but as the one soul who had given him life when the world would have let him die, and in that gaze she felt, for the first time in so many years, what it meant to be seen, to be wanted, and though fear tugged at her heart, so too did longing, fierce and undeniable, and in that moment beneath the vast western sky, Mary understood that fate had not merely placed a starving boy upon her doorstep but had given her a chance to live again, though what it would cost neither of them yet knew, for the West was a land that punished hope as quickly as it granted it, and their story was only just beginning.